This is Bart Peterson, and you are listening to the FCPA Compliance Report on the Compliance Podcast Network.
This is Greg Gilchrist, and you are listening to the FCPA Compliance Report on the Compliance Podcast Network.
This is Dan DeMarco, and you are listening to the FCPA Compliance Report on the Compliance Podcast Network.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, and I'd like to welcome you to the FCPA Compliance Report. Today, I have with me Mike DeBernardis. Mike is a fan favorite on the FCPA Compliance Report, and he and I take a deep dive into the Department of Justice's 2020 update to the evaluation of corporate compliance programs and the DOJ and SEC second edition to the FCPA Resources Guide. Every compliance practitioner will take away a key component of both documents in this podcast. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back again for another episode. You're in for a real treat today because I'm in for a real treat. That's because I have Mike DeBernardis back with me. Not only one of my favorites, but a fan favorite of the FCPA Compliance Report. So, Mike, first of all, welcome and thanks so much for taking the time to visit with me today.
Well, thanks for having me back, Tom. It's always fun to come on and talk to you.
Mike, we're going to take up two extraordinarily significant pieces of information released by the Department of Justice and SEC literally over the past 6 weeks. We're going to start with the 2020 update to the evaluation of corporate compliance programs released June 1, and then the FCPA Resource Guide second edition, which was released July 2. If maybe we could start with the 2020 updates, if there were sort of a few key themes that you saw, either evolutionary themes or something that pointed us perhaps in a new direction, what might those have been?
So I guess starting with a general comment, in my view, many of the changes made throughout the 2020 update were either what I would categorize as minor changes or changes that sort of made explicit what was already expected or done. And so, for example, with respect to management of third parties, the new guidance, the updated guidance, now explicitly states that prosecutors should look to see whether the company is continuously monitoring its third parties. That's really been a best practice for a while now, and something that if you look at DOJ enforcement actions, SEC enforcement actions, you'll see that prosecutors were already looking into those issues and criticizing companies if they did not continuously monitor. Similarly, with respect to, there's an addition in there about making sure that prosecutors look to see whether the company has determined that there was a valid business rationale for engaging a third party. Again, that's sort of best practice. There are other changes, though, that I think that were maybe subtle but more meaningful. With respect to training, there's a change made to indicate that prosecutors should look to see whether participants in training have the ability to ask questions. And, that might seem minor, but there's a lot of companies these days that we're seeing that are relying heavily on totally automated sort of online compliance training, sort of, click-through exercises. And this may signal that's, that alone may not be sufficient in terms of training. To me, the biggest change, and perhaps the most meaningful long-term change, is this emphasis that's been put on data and the compliance department's access to and ability to use data. And it comes up in a number of places actually in the update. I mean, most noticeably when discussing whether the compliance program has appropriate resources, they've added this series of questions regarding whether the compliance team has access to relevant sources of data to sort of allow for on-the-fly monitoring of the compliance program. And then in other places as well, they talk about, for instance, in discussing the policies and procedures, does the company track access to the policies and procedures to understand which ones employees are actually looking at, and other ways where there is slowly coming to be an expectation that compliance programs, particularly ones, more sophisticated compliance programs, are utilizing data in a similar way that their counterparts on the business side might be using data. And I think that's a potentially really significant change, and I think we're at the early stages of it for purposes of compliance programs, but it's the beginning of what I consider to be a significant trend.
Mike, in your practice, I would assume that you are called in either after something's happened or perhaps if a company thinks something has happened. Would you use a document? Would you use the evaluations both or as a benchmark, or would you use this to test a company's compliance program, or would you use this perhaps to help build out or remediate parts of a compliance program that didn't meet the government's expectations, or would you use it in a different way?
I think I would use it in both ways, and I've truthfully already had occasion to use this document, and a client recently asked for us to conduct really an assessment of their compliance program. This was a preventative measure, wanted to do a regular sort of audit of their compliance program, and this guidance, the updated version, was one of the sort of tools we use to measure their compliance program against. And I think that's where it can be really, really valuable when a company is trying to take a holistic view of their compliance program. This provides a good place, a good benchmark, if you will, to make sure they sort of have addressed all of the areas that a prosecutor might consider.
Like one of the things that I felt like I've observed over perhaps 10 years or so has been the evolution of the Department of Justice in putting out what they believe to be best practices, sort of as far back as the original FCPA guide. And we used to say, well, you have to read the tea leaves. But I really think the DOJ communicates what they want. They communicate it via enforcement action. They communicate it via speeches. But it seems like over the past few years, they've given us more concrete or at least direct communications, particularly starting with the original evaluation released in February of 2017. Would you find that to be a fair assessment, or do you see it perhaps in a different way since you're, I would say, more on the front lines?
No, I think that's right. I mean, there has been, and there might be a recency bias here since we've just received, as you noted, two really pretty significant pieces of guidance coming out of the DOJ in the last couple of months. But I over the last few years, there appears to be more of an effort to put practices into written form in form of policies. We had the corporate enforcement program, the anti-piling on policy, sort of changes with respect to how monitors are selected, and I think it's an effort at transparency in the practice of the DOJ, and I think part of it is really taking time to put in writing what had already been done, because I think that effort at transparency can be valuable for the DOJ, especially as it is trying to, partner with companies and really engage and get cooperation from companies. That transparency can be really important, and these documents are really important to that end.
Mike, do you find that when you sit across from the Department of Justice, if you happen to reference someone who's found themselves in an enforcement action, that you can use a document like the evaluation as a part of your presentation to at least argue to the department why a declination should be granted, a penalty should be lessened, or how your client has either met the best practices or remediated to best practices? Is that a way you could use this document?
Yeah, look, it's always nice to be able to sort of use the DOJ's own documents, own words in a presentation to them. That is, it puts it in a framework that that they both understand and expect. And so that is a useful use of this. Now, whether they agree on the actual conclusions you're drawing with respect to each of these elements, that's a different story. But it certainly helps create a framework for that discussion.
Mike, most of the folks I work with tend to be compliance professionals, so they're going to view the evaluation as, if not gospel, something that they really believe is useful for compliance. But you're talking to general counsels, you're talking to CEOs. When you make a presentation to a non-compliance group, are you able to use the evaluation as a strong guide for what you believe the DOJ wants to see?
I actually think this type of document can be even more useful in those conversations with high-level senior management and conversations with general counsels. I mean, the reason is that you have an opportunity at that point to show them something concrete, right? I think a lot of compliance professionals already understand a lot of these concepts, and they understand why they're important in terms of an effective compliance program. It's very helpful to be able to say to a CEO, you should do this because not only because it's best practice, not only because, in our experience, it's effective at preventing misconduct or detecting misconduct, but importantly, because the Department of Justice has in this written document explicitly stated that they expect you to do it. And I think when you're able to sort of show them the paper, that can be very helpful.
Mike, I was really intrigued in one of your answers. You tied the evolution of the DOJ Transparency on compliance programs to a series of other announcements we've had. You mentioned the Binkowski memo, certainly the FCPA corporate enforcement policy. Do you see all of these releases as kind of tied together in a way to give companies the information they might need to try to create a program, yet also communicate the DOJ's expectations and then even the penalties if an enforcement action does arise?
Whether they are all part of a singular strategic decision by the DOJ to be more transparent, I don't know. I certainly view them together in the sense that they offer companies who are trying to comply and trying to set up a program, based on their risks. They offer an insight into what the Department of Justice is looking for, what it considers to be important, and how it might react in certain situations. And so I think from that sense, to me, they all sort of further the same goal, and they're all sort of equally helpful in that analysis and those discussions with clients.
Mike, if we could now turn to the FCPA Resource Guide, second edition. When this document was originally released, I was probably one of the biggest to crow that this was the single most important one-volume FCPA resource. It had the law, it had declinations, it had the 10 hallmarks of an effective compliance program, it had the DOJ interpretations of their positions. They had some case law in there. I feel the same way now after the second edition, but I guess the one of the themes I felt was that much of the case law or some of the interpretations of cases, the DOJ gave their interpretation. And you and I might disagree. Certainly others have disagreed. And the more I thought about it, though, even that's of value if I could tell a client, this is what you're up against. This is what the DOJ is going to say. Is that a fair assessment as well? Or once again, you sitting on the front lines, do you see it a little bit differently?
No, I see it exactly the same. And to your point, I don't think you were alone in sort of recognizing the 2012 version of this as being a very important document. It was one that for years clients would point to, and one of those documents that when you're in a client's office, you often saw it as though they were reading it and paying attention to it. I will say I think it became less important as years went on because it became out of date, and that's why I think that this update was really important because there was elements. A lot has happened in the 8+ years since that initial document was released, and a lot has happened to change, to really alter what was in the document. So it had become less important. So this was really a necessary step. But to your point, the DOJ's interpretation is helpful whether I agree with it or not, and it's often helpful in discussions with clients. You can use Hoskins and the DOJ's interpretation of the Hoskins decision and the status of foreign agents as a good example. you might have a client who says, well, hey, in Hoskins, the Second Circuit decided that conspiracy and aiding and abetting alone could not, bring a foreign agent into the scope of the FCPA. And it's helpful to be able to point to a document like this and say that's true, and in the Second Circuit that's true. The DOJ is still taking the position that the scope is a little broader, and they're pointing to cases in other circuits that perhaps conflict with the Hoskins decision. And so it is, again, the arguments we can make at the court or with the DOJ itself. For discussions with the clients, it's really helpful to sort of get insight into how the DOJ might be thinking or interpreting certain decisions.
Mike, if I could ask, what were some of the 2 or 3 or however many top highlights from you for you from the second edition?
One that's really pretty small and may not even been noticed was with respect to the statute of limitations. I'd had conversations over the years that the way that the 2012 guide had discussed the statute of limitations was incorrect, at least with respect to the accounting provisions. And we had been surprised that they had allowed it to go on this long, but this guide does sort of take the position that the accounting provisions are technically securities fraud offenses, and they're subject to a 6-year statute of limitations, whereas the substantive FCPA anti-bribery violations would be subject to the catch-all 5-year statute of limitations. So it's just a small change, but one that could actually be very meaningful, and it's helpful to know at the outset, how the DOJ is approaching the statute of limitations with respect to these cases. I thought, from obviously, as I mentioned, it was an important update. There's a lot has happened, and actually, give credit where credit's due. I thought the resource guide did a really good job of trying to incorporate 8 years worth of developments into this document. And I think once again, now in its current edition, is really can be a useful guide for companies and for practitioners. One of my personal takeaways was the additional sort of guidance and focus on successor liability in the M&A context. And it parallels some of the changes made in the 2020 update to the compliance guidance as well. There's an understanding, as there has been, that pre-acquisition due diligence can be difficult, and there's reasons that you might not be able to do it. And it really, the guide really puts the emphasis on making sure you do effective post-acquisition integration and due diligence. And then I think I took it as an encouragement for companies to under the corporate enforcement policy, if you have acquired an entity and you subsequently discover a misconduct, to report it and try to take advantage of the potential benefits of the corporate enforcement policy. I thought it was interesting that the guidance, the resource guide here said, noted how few times that the DOJ has pursued charges against the company related to the activities of its of an acquired entity. Really trying to, I think, give some level of comfort to companies as they're going through what can be a difficult acquisition process.
Of course, we had the what I'm going to call the new hallmark, which is a root cause analysis, but that really ties into the point you made about the 2020 update to the evaluation, which is root cause analysis is not new. They started talking about it as early as 2015. Of course, it was in the evaluation, and now they put it into the hallmarks of an effective compliance program. And then the other thing that this I guess would also go to your point of the importance of this document may simply, or one of the important things is it was updated. And so now we have a corporate enforcement policy detailed. We've got, I really also appreciated your statute of limitations critique, because that's something that I think really companies need to be aware of, that they might be facing that as well.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I've personally been involved in cases where we're debating these issues and thinking about whether potentially discovered misconduct falls within the statute of limitations, and have to, it can get down to, as you might expect, a matter of months or weeks. And so knowing whether the DOJ is going to take the view that it's 5 years or 6 years can be potentially very meaningful for companies to know. And just the root cause point you made is an excellent one, because it's a little surprising going back and looking at the 2012 resource guide again, and this is something, root cause analysis, and sort of that has been a sort of a mainstay in an expectation for the DOJ. They want you to understand what happened and why it happened. And so it's natural now to see it as a hallmark of an effective compliance program.
Mike, if I could maybe change the focus just a little bit. I've had the opportunity to visit with several partners and lawyers at Hughes Hubbard. And what I wanted to ask is, I would have expected prior COVID-19, when everyone was at the office, you guys having a fairly robust debate internally about what some of these changes meant, how they should be interpreted, how that you all might use them going forward. Are you still able to have those debates virtually or in the sort of post-COVID world?
It's more complicated than it used to be, certainly, Tom. We do our best with Zoom and Blue Jeans and every other sort of technology that there is to have those discussions, or just over email. But I think one of the realities that we're facing now is in the old days, as I'll frame it, it was just several months ago, but we would have all popped into one office and as this came out, and had a 30-40-minute discussion about the things that we found interesting. And it's a little more difficult to do that. And truthfully, it's part of the reason why we're late on our own sort of advisory on this update, because it takes a little longer to make sure everybody's views get put into place and can be taken into consideration.
Mike, there was an article today in the FCPA blog talking about no one thought 2020 would be as significant a year for the FCPA, perhaps as it has been. We've now had Airbus, we've had Novartis, we've got these two major releases of information, and the article really made me crystallize my thinking that he's right. This year may be one of the most significant, and people like you and I may be unpacking. I may be unpacking this. You may be unpacking it, and you may be talking to your clients about things we learned about compliance programs and enforcement from this year, a lot more than we had thought. Would you have any thoughts on that, one way or the other?
No, I think that's it's really an excellent point. I mean, as the year started sort of slowly in terms of enforcement, minus the Airbus case, there was a thought, especially as the pandemic began to set in, that this might be a slow year. And I think what we're seeing is there's no such thing as a slow year in this space anymore. And I think, I don't know it for sure, but I believe it's possible that the pandemic and the restrictions it's had on the enforcement authorities from the DOJ and the SEC, that their restrictions on travel, it may have allowed them the sort of time they needed to put the finishing touches on these two documents, and it could be the reason that they came out sort of close in time, and so I think. For what we viewed as a potentially slow year, a lot has happened, and a lot of potentially very meaningful events have taken place, and potentially meaningful guidance has come out. That you're right, that we might be looking back on a few years thinking 2020 was a really big year for practitioners in this space.
So let me turn to one of my favorite subjects, the veiled land of the future. And one of the themes that I'm hearing from the Department of Justice and the virtual conferences that they attend are that enforcement will continue. There's no COVID-19 Q2 2020 get out of jail card free. But so is that something that you guys believe as well? And are you able to communicate that message to your clients that you really can't take your foot off the pedal?
Absolutely. I fully believe that. I think, the reality particularly with FCPA cases is they're often, the case comes several years after the fact, after the misconduct. And I will say, I believe that in 2026, when the DOJ may be investigating conduct from the second quarter of 2020, sort of the context we're in right now will have faded, and you won't remember how difficult it was to do anything during these few months, and the enormous pressure that compliance officers were under, and so I have every expectation that there will be no get out of jail free cards. There will be no credit given for misconduct that takes place during this pandemic. I think, at least for our clients, I think they get it, and honestly, I think that has been part of the reason that we've seen our clients, our colleagues in compliance functions throughout our clients really under a lot of pressure, because their job has been is more difficult now than it was a few months ago. But they realize they need to get to the same place and have the same results, and that can put a lot of pressure on people.
The other question I wanted to pose to you is, I've been intrigued by also the department's comments on robust enforcement. Is it going to put more pressure on compliance officers and compliance programs for another reason, which is the DOJ may need to look more or lean more heavily on self-disclosure now because of COVID-19, and recognizing the decision to self-disclose is perhaps one of the most difficult conversations you and your colleagues would have. But if a company does, is the DOJ going to start to rely on that more going forward?
Well, I think they would like to rely on it as much as possible, and I think it's why they promoted the corporate enforcement policy so much. I think it's why they included a discussion of it in the updated resource guide, because you save a lot of time and resources from the DOJ side to have companies come in and self-report. I think currently the DOJ